Good afternoon, Agnieszka Ostrowska, Center for International Relations. Welcome to our Zoom the World series organized by our center jointly with Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Poland. Today we will talk about war in Ukraine and possible scenarios for this country. And we are happy to have with us today Mirko Campochiari, who is a military expert, an opinion-making publicist, and also a founder of a channel, Parabellum, which is devoted to military history and geopolitics. And I must tell you that it has been quite popular recently with the war in Ukraine. Mirko, piacere di averti da noi.
Nice to meet you.
And we also have with us our president, Malgorzata Bonikowska, who is a historian and politologist. Mirko, expectations about Ukrainian counteroffensive are growing recently, have been growing for like 4 months already. And they cause a lot of speculations about possible dates and directions. And however, also for something like 4 months, the front line has changed only minimally. And right now, both parties, both Russians and Ukrainians, they seem to believe that they can win the war and they can reach most of the strategic, or maybe most of the strategic goals. So, do you think that Ukrainians are able to conduct a large-scale, successful counter-offensive, and taking into consideration the military potential of both sides?
Since the recent leaks, the Ukrainian needed to change pretty much their plans because the leaks was true. The guy was a young guy called Texira, and seems that he started leaking documents since the start of the war. So it's not something that he tried to fake or is a NATO disguised operation to foolish the Russians. The problem with the Ukrainians is their ability to absorb the equipment and the training. They lack manpower. The demographic of Ukraine is not the one of Russia. And the problem that they have is the different kind of technology we are giving them. The machines are very, very problematic for them in terms of logistic capabilities. The Leopard 2, the Abrams, the Challengers, and all the other infantry vehicles that we give to them will cause them a lot of problems in that sense. Also, the training they receive is a much smaller one than what we do usually with our military.
So do you think, because we usually think that the potential, that the fact of the successes of Ukraine is connected with the equipment that we send them. So you think that it's in some way is not used to the extent it could?
Yeah, they will never use that equipment to their maximum potential. And another big problem is that they don't have vehicles in backup, in the sense the amount of Leopard we give to them is so small that every time one of the vehicles get destroyed or damaged, it will go back to Germany or Poland. So whatever they need to achieve with their offensive, they need to do with what they have. Also, there is no expectation that in 6 months Europe will send to them another 200, 300 tanks, to give an example. And they know that. And that's a big problem for the Ukrainian military. If I was on the leadership of the Ukrainian military, I will tell them not to do the offensive.
Yeah. But do you think it is coming? I mean, because the declaration are still on the table.
It's coming because for political reasons, pressure from Europe. So external pressure, internal pressure. Of course, it's easy for me to say just stay on defensive because you inflict more damage than the damage you receive. The problem is that they are a country under invasion. So usually a country under invasion wants to liberate their country. So it's hard to not feel the pressure to gaining ground. But if you look at the numbers of the army compared to the numbers of the Russian, on September of the last year, Ukraine have number advantage. Now is not anymore the case. The Russian have it. And more the time goes, more the Russian have numbers. That's a big problem. Because Ukrainians need to not only send men to the front, but also to train people in the same moment. And it's very difficult for a country to have 20, 30, 50,000 people to send away while you are also needing people on the front line.
We have heard a lot about the trainings going on for the Ukrainians, but army, you don't think it is enough?
I don't think it's enough men. I don't think it's enough time. If you look the leaked documents, we can extrapolate from that how much training they received and how high was their readiness in that sense. And by what we extracted, many of the units didn't even receive all the equipment necessary. If you don't have the machines on what you are training. So judging by that, you will have all the 9/12 brigades ready for August at the best. So whatever they are going to do offensively, earlier than that, it will be a more localized thing. For example, a small counterattack near Bakhmut have sense, since the Russians overextended their position. They are on two salient, and once they complete the taking of Bakhmut, that's the most vulnerable moment for the Russians because they need to restabilize their positions. That will be a good moment for the Ukrainian to counterattack and probably entrap some of the Russians, considering that the majority of the troops Russians are using in Bakhmut are VDV, members of the avio troops, air transported troops, and Wagner, all infantry. They don't have a big capabilities in terms of movement. And also behind them, there is the Bakhmutsa River. So if the Ukrainians manage to attack them from the side, which they can, because they have a certain amount of territories more eastern than Bakhmut, they will be able to force them to retreat or either entrap them in Bakhmut. That is beyond the things that they can do.
Malgorzata, you wanted to jump in, so please do. And I would also want to ask you, why do you think Bakhmut is so important, and why so much pressure is given by the Ukrainians to defend it, to the city?
Well, I'm very much interested in what Mirko was saying, because from the political point of view, of course, we are all expecting the offensive of Ukraine, and we will see what will happen, because that's a crucial, absolutely crucial thing to decide the future, to decide the possible scenario for this country. On the battlefield, we'll see if the Ukrainian army is able to push back Russian troops out of Ukraine. Let's see if out of the whole country or just a part of the country. That it will be definitely the limitation concerning the negotiations, because it will be about how Russians feel about the whole story. If Russians feel that they may win, they will never give up. And the negotiations will not be real negotiations, because they will just continue like they were doing it in the first time of the war. So it's really absolutely crucial what will happen. And well, from what you are saying, I'm a little bit worried, because I can understand that the message would be that the Ukrainian offensive not necessarily will be a successful one, which makes a political problem then how to conclude the war. You know what I mean?
The problem is, even if he's successful, is not an offensive with these numbers that can resolve the war.
Be a game changer.
No, it will not be a game changer. They don't have that kind of capabilities. It can either resolve the position in Bakhmut very hardly. They can make a big offensive in Zaporizhia. First of all, because they are saying so, and when you are saying that you are doing an offensive in a certain place, you are not doing that in that place. Also because the majority of the Ukrainian soldiers are receiving that information, and usually when you want to fool your enemy, first you need to fool your own. So that's probably not where they're going to do the offensive. But in the best possibility, Ukrainian can just liberate a small portion of terrain. That's the problem. What will happen after? That's if things goes well. Let's not talk if things goes bad.
So what are the scenarios? I mean, forever war, ceasefire, I don't know, consolidation of Russia or Ukrainian victory that we would like the most. So in what direction, if we can try to predict the things will go according to you, Mirko, from the military point of view, and what do you think about that, Malgorzata? Because wars probably are not won on the battlefield, but politically.
It depends. Politics is, of course, a big factor because Ukrainian is completely dependent from European aid. They don't have pretty much a military production, while the Russian do. And they are growing and growing in that sense. The biggest problem here is that the Russian offensive is not really an offensive. Let's call it a continuous pressure more than an offensive. They usually now work on double sense, defensive line and pressure. They don't do any attack in terms of mobility. Probably they lost that capability. So they just pressure with artillery and infantry. It's culminated in the sense once they take Bakhmut, they are not able to do anything else offensively. So everybody is expecting the Ukrainians to take the initiative. But they should not do that. What they did in Bakhmut, besides the political factor that Bakhmut is a sort of Stalingrad for everybody, both for the Russian and for the Ukrainians, which is not a wise thing to do, to make a big deal of a small city that strategically talking don't have any big relevance, besides being a certain degree a logistical hub just for the region, but not for the overall country. So they made this big deal about a small city, and Zelensky also linked his fate to this city. In March, he gave order to retreat, or better, the military gave order to retreat, and then Zelensky pretty much called back the order. So there was a bit of confusion. Zelensky talked with Zaluzhny and Syrskyi, which is the general in charge of the Bakhmut area, and pretty much combines them to hold. But every strategy have a diminishing effect, in the sense the more you apply the same strategy over and over, the more the enemy adapt to your strategy, and you start to obtain less success from that. That's exactly what happened in Bakhmut. Bakhmut was very good for the Ukrainians because they were able to inflict 4-1, 3-1 kill-death ratio to the Russians. Now is the inverse, because the small area that they still holding is so small that the Russian can concentrate all their artillery and air power, and also the Ukrainian need to move into a small corridor to bring equipment and men. And every time they do that, they pay the toll.
So you don't think that this is a right tactics right now with Bakhmut?
Is more linked to politics. Zelensky need to hold Bakhmut. The army need the time, because we were very slow to send equipment. To give an idea, just 3 days ago, the Spanish sent the Leopards, even if they were promised months and months ago. If you consider that plus at least 2 or 3 months of training, the Ukrainian need the time, and the time is running low.
That's right. Malgorzata, what is your intake on that?
Well, I think, we have to be very careful about this Western camp, because Russia is a federal state, while NATO and the whole coalition of over 50 countries, there are different countries, different interests, different politicians, and different moods. And also, we are democratic societies, where the societies also, the people have their thoughts and comments, and, they feel different things. At the beginning, they were very much enthusiastic about, support for Ukraine, because it was evident who attacked whom, and Russia was definitely unanimously seen as a threat and as an aggressor. But with the time, the emotions cool down and people are tired. And I think it's not only in Europe, even in the United States, there are discussions, larger and larger discussions what to do with this war. So I think every politician in the Western camp has to take it into consideration. So that's one factor. We are not divided. We are still, very much united around Ukraine, but maybe it's the last moment when the West is so united. We really want the Ukrainian army to prevail somehow. And I think political spheres, still, the political leaders are confident that the Ukrainians can push back a little bit, can be successful. Well, this is, I think, the crucial year for the war, maybe the crucial months, because whatever happens in the battlefield, that will be definitely from the Western part, some temptation to really finish off this war sooner than later. And I think especially in the European Union is very, very visible, because it's our, neighborhood. We don't want instability forever. We don't want a second Syria to happen just at the eastern border of European Union. So I think people just can't imagine that this will be a permanent, conflict like that. Despite the fact
there are predictions, there are scenarios that the war can be forever. I mean,
well, but that's exactly what we want to avoid.
Rome.
That's exactly what we want to avoid. We know that it may happen, but we don't want this to happen. So I think, like now, Ukrainians are pushed to do something in the battlefield, that they will be more and more later on pushed to negotiate. There will be definitely this mood to, conclude something. Then the second factor is Russia itself. It's very much, obvious for all the Europeans and United States as well that Russia is there. I mean, we don't have a war with Russia. It's not, nothing is planned like that. We want to avoid a conflict. So if Russia still remains the neighbor, despite all the, thoughts we could have around Russia that it can maybe, change the leader, or something major can happen to Russian unity, very unlikely, but there are also voices like that. The reality is that this country is there and it will remain there as our neighbor. So the thoughts and the dialogue now, it's very much about how to handle Russia. Not only how to handle the war, but how to handle Russia as a country who is there and who has still friends all over the world. Because in the meantime, the West is realizing that it's not only the West and Russia, it's also Russia vis-a-vis other countries, powerful countries such as China, but not only China, such as India, Indonesia, all, ASEAN and Southeast Asian states. The BRICS, we just will have just the summit of BRICS countries, and South Africa just announced that they withdraw from the International Criminal Court just because they want Putin to come over and they don't want to arrest him. So we have to take it into consideration that politically speaking, the West is not the major player. It's not the only player. We have to confront our interest with the interest of global South. And here Russia has friends, still countries who want to deal with Russia, want to make business with Russia, want political...
To sell army to Russia. And that's my question
weapons.
Weapons, that's right. And Mirko, I wanted to ask you, because Russia allegedly has received recently like a new shipment of these kamikaze attack drones, and they are Iranian made. Ukraine in turn has just received American Patriots. And I would like to ask you, who are the main suppliers of the military equipment to both sides? If you could tell us, because this is something that we do know and we don't need to predict.
First of all, I agree with Malgorzata said, because Russia is not alone. That's a fantasy that we tell each other in Western society. If you analyze how much of the world is on the side of the Russia, you realize that they are more than us. It's 4 billion people against less than 1 billion. So again, we just tell a Western-centric story, and that's a big problem. Talking about the weapons that are being delivered, but not only weapons, there is other stuff that is more important, like semiconductors. They come from China, they come from India. Thanks to some links that I have in connection, we discovered that the biggest exporter of Russian oil is Greece, in the sense that Greek ships sail to Russia, take the oil, go back to Greece, they change flag to Panamese or others, thanks to Navy advocates, lawyers, and in 24 hours the ship have changed pretty much flag, and now it can free sail and sell that Russian oil that now have become Panamese to the rest of Europe. The same is doing India. Some months ago, the Russians were buying a lot of old tankers, oil tankers, a lot of them, like hundreds, and we were wondering why you can't insure them, because no insurance company will insure such an old rusty ship. And then we discovered that they get sold to Indians and then sell it back. So that's another trick they use. The other trick that they're using is Chinese companies, which have a subsidiary in Holland and other country like Brussels or even Switzerland. And they simply buy semiconductor and chips and then sell them to Turkey, and Turkey sell them to Russia. So there is a lot of black market involving this kind of stuff. Recently, with some connection, we discovered that even Italians and Swiss people sell a lot of gold and other high value metals from Russia, because they have direct connection there. They really arrive in ingots with Russian marking. They get melted into smaller portion and then sold into the European markets. And that was just one company. And he told me probably the other 7 he's knowing about it, doing the same. So the Russian, like an old friend of mine say, money are like water, they always find a way. Doesn't matter how hard you try to block them. Also, we told each other a very strange story that with the sanctions, this war will be over. The economy of Russia will collapse in a week. I usually use an analogy. When the Italian invaded Ethiopia, we were the first country in the world to get the sanctions. It didn't stop us. We got problems on World War II. We didn't have the money to make good airplanes. We still went to war with biplanes thanks to the sanction we received 5 years before. And the same will be for Russia. It will not stop them in the war. It will probably block their economy 4 or 5 years from now. But stopping the war with sanctions, it never happened. That's another lies that we tell each other in Europe. But that's a big problem.
So what does that mean? Does that mean that we should forget the sanctions, according to you?
No. We could not expect that the sanction will have an effect on a military sense, and should not be selling that way. That's a big problem.
I agree also with Mirko as far as sanctions. I think they are necessary, but the effect comes with the long run, and the research done on many different kind of sanctions implemented before against many other countries shows that normally they work in 50% of the cases. So even if they are implemented and last longer, not always it changes really the regimes and the course of the game. But I think what matters now also concerning this black market, it's also the factor of time. Because the problem is that at the beginning it's a shock always, and it mobilizes people. But with the time, people get used to certain things. So the worst what we can get is that people will get used to the fact that, okay, Ukraine is under war, so all these companies and moves are made, and we are just in a way back to normal. I think what is now important is really to have a courage, and especially this will be difficult for the Ukrainian government, have a courage to say enough. We have to now think about our future, and we have to really start thinking how to get out of this conflict, even if we didn't provoke it. Russia is a very dangerous player. It's a very serious threat, also in the sense of the global role of Russia. It's the biggest country on earth by territory. Even if it's not as strong as Soviet Union, was definitely is much weaker now. It's a junior partner in negotiations to China, but it's an important global player. We could see it even in Sudan recently when the Wagner groups were engaged, and the situation of Egypt is influenced by what's happening in the south of this country, which makes Egypt cooperating with Russia politically. That's why Egypt will not condemn Russia in Ukraine. All this is very much connected. And there are many places all over the world where Russia is seen as an actor. So I think the biggest challenge now is really how to visualize the future negotiations without, we don't want the situation where Russia will understand that that's our weakness. That's the tricky part, because we want to avoid the situation when Russia will say, okay, like in the Crimea case, we did something, we did it quickly and the world didn't react. Now, the invasion, of course, was a huge reaction in the West. But at the end of the day, after 1 year of war, or 2 years of war, Russia will say, okay, we won. Again, we got some territories. So that's the scenario we don't want to have. So
But that's the tricky part, in the sense that Italy, for example, we tell each other that we are not in war. That's a big problem in the sense Italy have the sensations, yes, we sent the weapons, but we are not in war with Russia. Like Russia will not perceive us as an enemy, but they say otherwise. That's the big problem. We tell we are not in war. That's the usual Italian position, We just on the balance between falling and jumping, and we send the weapons and we consider each other out of this war. That's what we are telling each other. Our government try to play around that, because in Italy, 56% of the people is against sending weapons. Is a majority. But the Russians tell us that they are our enemies, but we don't tell them that we are their enemies. That's a big problem, because if I need to talk about Mark Milley and other American generals, when the Ukrainians were winning back in September of the last year, they were already talking and try to push Ukraine to settle. You need to talk now since you are on an advantage moment. That's what they were trying to do, because the Americans don't intend to follow the Ukrainians to the border of 1991. It's not feasible from a support standing point militarily. It's not possible.
Especially with the lacking consent of the American society for the war and for sponsoring.
Yeah, you see now what's happening. The Congress, first of all, Biden removed back the law where the leader of America, the president, can declare war and declare for the sending equipment. Now they moved back that law, which was made for Bush, which caused a lot of problems, back to the Senate. And now in the Senate, there is already a conglomerate of senators that are trying to say no more weapons to Ukraine. We want a certain political agenda to realize when it will be peace, which is impossible. For making peace, you need both sides to agree. I think the best solution we can aim for is to make Russia realize they can't win militarily. That means a complete stalemate. Exactly. Because at the moment we abandon the Ukrainians or the offensive is not doing good, I can tell you what a lot of my journalist contacts and contacts in Ukraine or even in Russia are saying. The Russians are very happy to wait for the Ukrainian offensive, because from their standpoint, they are not afraid. They know that this after wave of Ukrainians, behind there is nothing. So if they survive this, or if they absorb this offensive, doesn't matter how successful it is, later for them it will be easier. And what's happening in Europe is giving them all the reason to think that. We are not sending the jets. Not that the Ukrainians are capable of absorbing the jets. To give you an idea, even if we give them 200 F-16, they will be unable to operate them. They don't have the pilots. They don't have any meaning to support them logistically. They don't have how to defend their airports. The best way to allow the Ukrainians to compete against the aeronautics of the Russians is not by their own aeronautics. You can't invent in 1 year a gap that exists since 30 years. Even if we give them 200 airplanes, The Russians have 3,000. So what worked in this war? Why the Russians are not particularly doing well with their aeronautic? Anti-air. They are easy to train. We can give them in numbers. So if we can't make the Ukrainians compete with their aeronautics, we can inhibit Russian from using their. That's the best solution we have in short term for Ukraine. Give them a lot of anti-air capabilities. That is feasible. We can train them in 5 weeks. The losses are very low. What we trained can train as well other Ukrainians, and that will provide also coverage for the ground troops.
This is being done. Is it not
Partially.
enough?
It's not enough. Their consume of missiles is so high that by May they will be out of missiles. And the problem is that majority of their first defense is Buk system and S-300 system, which are Soviet made, and they are not making more of that. And in Europe, we don't have many of them to find. So at certain point, the Ukrainians will need new anti-air systems, which only West can provide in numbers, and especially only America with the Patriot system. And the problem is that while an S-300 or a Buk system of Soviet origins have a wide range from 200 to 300 kilometers, the Patriot, the SEMPT, the IRIS-T, and all the system we made in Western, they are more point-to-point defense. They are think to cover bases and things like that. So they have 70 kilometers range at best. So if you want to cover the same amount of terrain, and Ukraine is pretty big, you need twice the amount, if not 3 times the amount of the anti-air system that the Ukraine at the moment possess. That means giving them at least 150 systems. And I don't see that inclination overall.
Actually, this is quite a pessimistic picture that you are drawing here.
They don't have much time. The more the time goes, even if we tell each other that the sanction will going to stop the Russians, the more the Ukrainians will lack missiles, because missiles, tanks, and the others. And this dependency from Europe is the biggest problem, is their weak link. Because every time we spend months to discuss what to send, and this creates a sort of opportunity for the Russian. To give you an idea, this offensive that happened in winter, technically, it's our fault, not Ukrainian, because our military leaders should have think that the moment the parking of Russian equipment in Ukraine went down by numbers, by consumption, we needed to intervene and instantly create a chain of supply with Western equipment. We didn't do that. We spent 6 months arguing what to send. So pretty much when the equipment of Soviet origin of the Ukrainians went down, instead of have instantly Western equipment taking over, we created this gap. And this gap was what the Russians pretty much exploited. So we created that gap. And now it will happen again. Doesn't matter if the offensive goes well or goes bad, there is now already 300 tanks or thousands of infantry vehicles as a second batch for another offensive. So,
but what about Russian military potential? Because it is also not, invincible.
Yeah, they're not flamboyant. For what we have seen, there is a big difference. First of all, their lifestyle is much lower than other countries. That means in military terms, they are more eligible to absorb a shock like sanctions and deprivations. That's a peculiarity of Russia overall in history, and that is an advantage. To give you an idea, you remove 1 degree of thermostat in Italy and there is already a scandal. If we need to lower by 1, in Russia they don't know what is a thermostat probably in majority of the country, so it's not a big deal. That's an advantage in terms of war. That was described already during World War II. The German generals always said that the advance of a Russian army is something that the Western country can't even conceptualize, because they simply bring food on their own backpack and they go ahead. or people will stop if they don't receive a hot meal. So that is a big advantage for Putin. The system he made in over 20 years cementified pretty much his position. And you see, there is no big riot or uprising in the country. In Ukraine already there is some units that is bringing problems. The territorial brigades are linked to their territory, but now because of needs of war, the Ukrainians are forced to send these territorial brigades, which by law need to operate near to the city where they formed, to the front line. And that is causing a lot of internal problems where the parents go and say, why my son from Kryvyi is in Avdiivka? He's supposed to stay in Kryvyi. So they have some democratic problem in Ukraine of that kind. In Russia, there is no problem. They take you from Abkhazia or whatever, and they send you to the front, and there is nothing you can do about. That's why people is running away from the country. Recently, they changed the recruitment because it was 30 years that Russia didn't do a mobilization. So they were not prepared to absorb that amount of people. Now they are doing a sort of continuous mobilization. Every month, 15, 20,000 people get mobilized in Russia. And they do by digital form because they were using the old system where you receive the paper. And if you are not at home and you didn't take that personally on hand, technically you didn't avoid the system. Now they send that digitally to your mail. So even if you were not home, for them, the moment you receive that even digitally, you are eligible. So wherever they take you, at work, at school, university, you go. So
but that might finally create some ferment within the Russian society, this huge scale mobilization.
They disguised that now. Is a smaller tickling of numbers during each month. It's not more 300,000 with a big announcement. There now is a continuous thing, and there is a normal tendency of the people to adapt, even to war, even to mobilization, even to deprivation, things like that. Even in Europe, we are kind of adapting to the situation of a continuous war. They are making 3 turns shifting at work. They work 24 hours in the fabric to make missiles, caliber, and Fab 500 bombs. In Europe, we don't even have that in consideration. We are not in a war economy, to give you an idea. You can say what you want about Russia, but the Nebulina, the administrator of the Russian bank, did a wonderful job, and that's every economy guy is telling that. For what was their position, she did magic tricks. Now it's slowly started to going down. So that's the problem. We are not considering each other in war. For Russia is a war. And if it was a Putin war at the start, the big mistakes, big judgment mistakes, slowly it's become a Russian war of the people because they realize that if they fuck up this war, their country will collapse. And they don't want to see another dissolution of the Soviet Empire, to give you an idea. So Putin managed to do that, managed to transform this war, a Putin war, to a Russian war, which was the biggest problem that I foreseen for this war. As long as it was his problem, probably there was a possibility to get rid of him or remove him or something like that. At the moment that he managed to sell the story to the Russian that all the Western world is against them, the NATO is there, watch what the Russians say in their own TV. We're not fighting Ukraine. We're fighting NATO. There is Polish people there. There is Georgians. There is Americans. There is Canadians. They try to barely talk about Ukrainians. Ukrainians, for them, are simply puppet of the West. They have been taken by the West, like poor children. They got foolish. The real war, the real enemy behind the Ukrainians is the West. So it doesn't matter how this war goes, in the sense that if they make a settlement between Ukraine and Russia from the standpoint of the Russian, if they can hold whatever they have taken so far, they won against the NATO. So internally, they will sell that story. We fight us against everyone, like in the Great Patriotic War. That's the story they are telling each other.
So can they afford actually Ukraine to stay with the borders before the war?
No,
Borders.
they can't, because that will cause a big problem internally. They will. Remember, Italy lost World War II. Germany lost World War II. We learned that lesson. The Russians never lost a war in that sense, that forced them to do an internal analysis of their errors. And they never want to do that. Even the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's solved as Western corruption because of what happened in the 90s when they tried to change from the socialistic state system to our system. So they never try to analyze themselves. There is never autocritics in them. So they will never accept something like that. That's the biggest problem to deal with Russia. How we deal with a country that, even if it's a beaten dog, because it was supposed to be the second army in the world, and these 9 months they're trying to take a city of 70,000 people, which is smaller than the city where I live, Leghorn, which is not a particular big city. They will never accept that. They have a big consideration of themselves as one of the biggest power in the world, and they are atomic wise, but clearly they are not anymore in the classic term. They're more regional power, but they will never accept that position. So how will you impose that to them? Unfortunately, the only way is to make it knock with the head of the Ukrainians until they realize they can't win this militarily. So you need to stop them. And for the Ukrainians, making a game of offensive against counteroffensive against offensive on and on is not the best job. The best things they can do is stay on defensive and inflict as much damage as possible to the Russian army up to the point that they can't absorb that kind of losses anymore. Even Russia don't have infinite tanks, infinite tankers. It's easier to build the tank than the men that drive the tank. That's the biggest problem. Yes, they can start to remove the old tanks from the deposits, T-55 and even World War II stuff if they want. The problem is the people that need to drive that kind of vehicles. So the best solution for Ukrainians is do what the Finnish did. The Finnish play only an defensive war against the Russians with incredible odds against them. And even if they lost the war, because technically they did, the Russians simply moved away from the Mannerheim line and avoided the biggest, strongest point of the Finnish. They essentially, at the end, from the war, eyes of the world, won that war, because it was impossible that Finland managed to hold the Russians. From the eyes of the world, Ukrainian already won in that sense. If there is one thing that Putin failed completely, was to negate Ukraine. Ukraine is stronger internally as a bound, as a country. It's like the resurgency in that sense. They find a unification into this war. This war, probably whatever it will be of Ukraine in terms of territory, it will be more compact than ever. That's the biggest failure of Putin, since he tried to deny the existence of Ukraine. And the second was he made the NATO stronger. NATO didn't even have a purpose before this situation.
Putin's moves turned out to be quite often totally counterproductive. Malgorzata, because our time is running, I would like to ask you about your final comments. Maybe.
Well, I think on the positive note, I think for the Ukrainians, there is really a chance to get out of this huge tragedy as much as they can now for the future. I think the future of Ukraine suddenly speeded up vis-a-vis European Union. I think it's now very difficult for the EU to reject the Ukrainian aspirations to join the EU one day. It will be really problematic, because all the blood they are, giving for our values as well. So it speeded up the process of enlargement also for the Balkans, and it puts a lot of pressure on the EU itself to discuss how to do it. It will not happen soon, but it should happen in the future. So it means a challenge that we will have 30 plus countries in the EU, and Ukraine, if it's inside, it will be an important player. This gives this country really a chance to go a similar way, transformation of similar way like Poland did, or even deeper, because Ukraine was a part of Soviet Union. Poland never was. So I think it's a huge chance for this country. It's also a wonderful, and I agree with Mirko, a wonderful moment for the Ukrainian identity to really construct the concept of Ukraine as a state. And also, you know, it's worldwide known. Now Ukraine is known everywhere. Everybody knows that this country exists. Earlier, it wasn't the case. It was completely unknown entity. So I think Ukrainians have to build as much as they can to attract capital for rebuilding the country. But to do that, they need the war to be over. So I think it's really kind of a, you know, game now, political game about when really to stop it and how to stop it, because this country, to avoid the scenario of a second Syria, to have a positive scenario, this country has a chance to join the Western community, which was unlikely completely even 5 years ago. So Ukrainians, to me, they fight to be out of the Russian mir forever. Well and good, you know, that's the only chance for them, because we cannot leave them neutral, because if we leave them neutral, it will be taken by Russia again. So I think that's a very positive scenario. Under condition we'll be able to somehow, you know, stop the war.
As long as they don't join the NATO, because that will be the biggest problem.
Yes, but Mirko, let's be frank, in de facto, they are already in NATO. In formally, no, but de facto, they are a key element of European infrastructure or environment of security. They are a buffer zone between, you know, the West and Russia.
I agree with that. But that's exactly why the Russian will never stop. The war in Donbass was financed by the Russian exactly to make Ukraine in a state of war that will never be joined in NATO, because we can't accept
yeah, but this invasion made it possible, and this invasion made Ukraine really much Western than it was before. That's why I think Putin committed a mistake, because Ukraine earlier was really could be like Georgia now, much more under control of Russia than now. Now it's done. Ukrainians hate Russians. Ukrainians don't want to belong to this sphere of influence. It's not only the top leaders, there are also people like that. You know, this brotherhood between Ukrainians and Russians is over forever, maybe. So this is a factor Putin didn't take into consideration 1 year ago, but apparently, obviously now it's not possible, I mean, to get back to normal between Russia and Ukraine. And in this way, you know, NATO, in a way, without even naming Ukraine as a member, maybe this will never happen, but it's de facto a buffer controlled by, like, you know, like Sinai earlier, you know, maybe a territory where, you know, no one will touch it because it has to be a buffer between the West and Russia. And I think I pretty much believe Ukraine is very big. It's the biggest territory. It's the biggest country, except for Russia, the biggest country in Europe by size. Even if they lose, if you say that, you know, they will not be able to keep integrity of the territory completely, they still be a very, very big country for the European standards. So I believe for the European architecture, security architecture, Ukraine is very much into the Western, you know, the Western hemisphere.
They are, but we return to the buffer countries, which is not a guarantee of security.
Yes, but I have to argue with you, you know, for Poland, it's a big achievement as well, because Poland was a buffer earlier. You know, when the West was ending in Germany, we were in all the security strategies, we were a battlefield. You know, if something happens, it happens on the Polish ground. Now, the strategy of Poland is very clear. We don't want anyone to cross even the border to enter in our territory, because we have Ukraine. So this is, you know, a huge modification of all the, you know, security combination we will have in Europe for the future.
The problem is that in the future we will enter into the security dilemma again. That means rearm on both sides, a new Iron Curtain.
And I think that this should be a subject of our maybe future discussion, because our time is running. Of course, the security architecture has changed radically. And this is something to be taken into consideration. We can be happy that the total victory of Russia right now is unlikely, although the precise outcome of the conflict is still unknown. So I would like to put a dot here and thank you very much for all your insightful comments. And once again, I would like to I would like to encourage all our viewers to visit your blog, Mirko. We have put it in the comments. It's in Italian, but maybe it is also time to think about English version, so that to be more internalized.
Or auto-translate.
And Mirko, thank you very much
audiences.
for being with us today, because it's the first time you appear in our project, our conversations, and I hope it's not the last one, because congratulations for your job and your analysis as far as the war is concerned.
Thank you, most certainly so.
Yeah. Thank you, both of you, and thank you for watching us. Goodbye.